Hello, BookTube. I wanted to do an impromptu Monday reads for you. I haven't done one of these in a few days. And what I want to do is make recommendations from some of the books that I've been reading recently. These kinds of videos are going to wind down as the year winds down. But I have 4 recommendations here that I wanted to make sure I shared with you. And the first one was at the center of a bookish controversy last week. It's Of Blood and Bone by Nora Roberts. It's book 2 in her first attempt at an epic fantasy series. Called, I believe, The Chronicles of the One. Shows you that everything old is new again, or maybe that she's a beginner, in that one of the most woolly old cliches of epic fantasy, the idea that a character is the chosen one, is at the heart of this series, and it's actually called The Chronicles of the One. And the reason that it was in bookish news is because a YA author whose debut novel, Children of Blood and Bone, has, the title, it's kind of a cliche anyway, and the title is similar in a way, and when she became aware that Nora Roberts' latest book was called Of Blood and Bone, she immediately went on Twitter and accused Nora Roberts of plagiarism in order to profit off association with her book's title. I'm sorry, it's still kind of funny, because Children of Blood and Bone will be lucky if it sells 10,000 copies, 14,000 copies. And Nora Roberts is, of course, one of the most prolific and best-selling novelists in the world. And Nora Roberts is notoriously not on social media. She was flushed out of her writing room long enough to write a stinging rebuke of Tomi Adeyemi, the YA author. Tomi Adeyemi did everything wrong. She made an accusation of theft to one of the most established writers in the world, without her checking the facts in any way, and then left the accusation up for a long time. And even once she took it down, did so only in the half-hearted 10% way that millennials tend to do anything. There was no heartfelt apology. It was more like, well, now that I've been satisfied that I was not being robbed by this person named Nora Roberts, who I've never heard of, I'm willing to meet her halfway. Ridiculous. But lost in the controversy, I worried, was that this is actually a very entertaining series. It is, as you can tell from the series title, it's intensely predictable. This is not breaking new ground. But I read the first book in the series and thought, well, I'm not seeing anything new here. But one thing that I am seeing is why this person sells hundreds of millions of books, because she really knows what she's doing. On a line by line, on a paragraph by paragraph, on a chapter by chapter basis. She really knows what she's doing. It's very hard to stop reading a Nora Roberts novel once you've started. Even if you are an SFF fan who has seen all of this before, because believe me, you have seen all of this before. This is the story of, there was a blight that struck the world and killed a lot of people. And in the post-apocalyptic aftermath, there are forces of good and forces of evil in a destroyed world, and there is a chosen one, a young woman who, of course, doesn't know the extent of her abilities and needs to be trained in secret, and on whom the fate of the whole world will reside. In other words, if you read science fiction and fantasy, you will have encountered this a billion times. It's very familiar territory. I wonder if we can get a description. I wonder if there's any kind of a brief description that I can give you. Okay, well, yeah, this will do. They look like an everyday family living an ordinary life, but beyond the edges of this peaceful farm, unimaginable forces of light and dark have been unleashed. Fallon Swift, approaching her 13th birthday, barely knows the world that existed before. The city where her parents lived, now in ruins and reclaimed by nature since the Doom, with a capital D, sickened and killed billions. Traveling anywhere is a danger, as vicious gangs of raiders, with a capital R, and fanatics called purity warriors search for their next victim. Those like Fallon in possession of gifts are hunted, and the time is coming when her true nature, her identity as the One, capitalized, can no longer be hidden. And this book, a large chunk of it deals with her training in secret and her approaching closer and closer to her destiny, towards admitting it and embracing it. And it's not original, but it is really, really good. It's really, really readable. And I can now report on what is perhaps the crowning irony of that whole controversy on bookish Twitter, which is that Of Blood and Bone by Nora Roberts is much, much more enjoyable a book than Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. She could, instead of accusing Nora Roberts of theft, she really could have sat back and learned a lot. And maybe that will happen. Who knows? That's the first recommendation. And it could happen that Tomi Adeyemi comes back, right? I mean, generally speaking, I've seen that the only kind of scandal that you really can't come back from in the book world is when you yourself are caught plagiarizing. If you accuse someone else of plagiarizing, you can eat a certain amount of crow. Tomi Adeyemi has not done that yet, but maybe she won't, and that's okay. But if you accuse somebody else of plagiarism and the world comes down on you and you sort of weasel out of it, I have known people to have careers after that, so it could happen. I'd be interested to see. But the next one is not post-apocalyptic fiction by a romance author. Instead, it's far more in Steve's wheelhouse. It's Jane Glover's Handel in London. This is Jane Glover was a prolific conductor on her own. I mean, she's a musicologist in her own right. She has performed Handel, and now she's written a sizable book about him and about his time in London as the sort of the court composer to the Hanoverians. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. It ripples along. I, of course, am a big fan of Handel. Usually, most people who only have a passing familiarity with classical music will only hear The Messiah, and they will only hear that at this time of year. And I don't mind that. I absolutely love The Messiah, but I love all of Handel. I love everything. Off the top of my head, it would be hard pressed to come up with anything that he composed that I don't love. And I have read I've read two biographies of Handel. This one was right up there with them. It's extremely grounded in a knowledge of Handel's music, but the thing that surprised me is how grounded it also is in history, especially the relationships between Handel and the Georges, the King's George and the Prince's George, that sort of stuff. The personal side of Handel hustling for money and renown was done wonderfully in this book. Again, like with the Nora Roberts book, you won't stop reading, especially if you're interested in classical music. Then this next one is mytho-history. Although it's got so much history in it that I was delighted. I almost came out thinking, well, gee, I wonder if there's anything to that. This is by Nicholas Higham, and it's King Arthur. It's this lovely finished copy. It's a gigantically detailed historical study of the story of King Arthur, where the story comes from, where all the elaborations come from, and what could be the historical grounding for any or all of it. And if you are interested in the subject of King Arthur, I am, you will probably have read a couple, at least, of other books on this subject. It is a popular thing to do. Arthur's Britain, for instance, or In Search of Arthur's Britain. There have been, in decades past, big books on this subject that go into the same area. You know, they go into all of the earliest attempts at history by British historians. They go into all sorts of highly detailed incunabula from the fall of Rome in Britain, from the withdrawal of the Roman Empire's outposts in Britain. And this book does the same thing, but far more searchingly, far more detailed than anything that I've ever read on the subject. This is kind of the final word on understanding King Arthur, where the myth comes from, how the myth has grown, and who King Arthur might actually have been. So if you are an Arthurian, there are plenty of them on BookTube. If you are an Arthurian, this book deserves a place in your library. I know that there have been a million books on the subject, but this is exhaustively researched, and yet it's not dry. It's extremely entertaining to read. So I highly recommend it. All these are recommends. And then the last one is something we've seen on this channel before. This is by Garrett Peck, and this is The Great War in America. I'm trying to navigate the light here. So I turn the light on over my shoulder, it looks like I'm being interrogated by the Nazis. But then at least I have good lighting for the title of the book. But you can see that, right? You can kind of sort of see that. This situation of me sitting hunched over blankets and pressed against a space heater is not going to last. Sooner or later, we will get temperate weather again. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that this works as a compromise. This is a study of World War One through an American lens, which it's the fifth book of its kind, dealing with some aspect of that subject in 2018, and it was really good. The American Expeditionary Force, America's actual military involvement in World War One, was handled much better by a couple of other books, and the dissident politics, what's the word I want? Resistance. The resistance to the idea of America getting any closer to a European politics or getting involved in a gigantic war. Those things, that aspect of the subject has also been done better. But they're all done well in this book anyway. And the thing that really pleased me in this book was Woodrow Wilson, was the American president during World War One. That kind of surprised me. And the author has a real feel for it. I wouldn't mind at all seeing this author take 2 years off and write a gigantic biography of Woodrow Wilson. That you can't have enough of those. But I wanted to read you a bit, just so you get a flavor of how this author navigates. He's read all of the primary sources, and boy, oh boy, does he have a good way of stitching them together so that you get historical synthesis, but also terrific lines and character insights. And this is after Wilson has had his crippling stroke. And members of Congress are concerned about him, or concerned trolling him one way or another. 2 months passed without anyone seeing President Wilson in public. Finally, 2 senators, Albert Fall and Gilbert Hitchcock, visited the White House to check on the patient's condition, what Wilson called a smelling committee. The 19th century, the early 20th century version of concerned trolling. The Republican Fall was a noisy critic of the president. He told Wilson, "Mr. President, I want you to know that I am praying for you." According to Edith Wilson, Wilson remarked, "Which way, Senator?" And the meeting concluded on a humorous note. However, the president was offended at Fall's line of questioning. "If I could have got out of this bed, I would have hit the man," he told David Houston. An unusual statement, if true, showing how much the stroke had changed Wilson's personality. Why did he want to put me in bad with the Almighty? He must have known that God would take the opposite view from him on any subject. You note that, if true, which is a classic little sign, a little offhand sign that you're dealing with a very good reader of history. A lot of popularizers of history would hear an anecdote like that and leave out the if true. They wouldn't even raise the question of whether or not, gee, this seems uncharacteristic. I wonder if it was actually said at all. Instead, you could easily picture a kind of a popularizer finding a story like that and just reporting it. Forget about whether or not it might be true. It's good. But he goes on to talk about Wilson in intimate terms. Wilson's stroke did not affect his speech, nor did he have much facial drooping, but walking was now nearly impossible for him. He had lost the use of his left arm and his left leg. He was blind in his left eye, and his mind was prone to wander. The great voice that had once filled stadiums and halls was now weak. After his stroke, Wilson did not shave for 6 weeks, and his beard grew long and shaggy. And little bits like that. I mean, Wilson's not the only one. Wilson's wife, Mrs. Wilson, is likewise drawn wonderfully in this book. And it's also true of a lot of American politicians at the time and some European politicians. So that surprised me. I mean, the Great War in America is an enormous subject. This is not a particularly enormous book. But if you're interested in the subject of World War I America, or of Woodrow Wilson, then this is a book to check out. This is a book to read. I think you would find a lot in here that you'll find very memorable. And that is it. That is just a brief Monday Reads. We've got, I don't know if we can do a Steve pile in this lighting. We've got The Great War in America, We've got King Arthur, an outstanding work of scholarship, just outstanding. We've got Handel in London, study about a German composer and a stranger in a strange land who got by making, with the greatest calling card of them all, by making just immortal music all the time, practically whenever he turned around. And last, of Blood and Bone, by the indefatigable Nora Roberts, who had her honesty questioned in public by a debut author. How's that for chutzpah? And that's it. That's just a brief, just to let you know some of the things that I read a little while ago that I want to recommend to you. And I'm going to wrap this up for now, but we have plenty more to talk about. So I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.